And fantasy basketball has been annoying me this year, I would say, Dan. Annoying me a lot.
I mean, I just like the if you guys peep the thumbnail, just appreciate all of the views and the effort that Bryan took to get the most agonizing faces for these players and their injuries, because that's really what he's feeling, and that's what he wants to vent today to me about. And I feel him. I feel him. There is a lot of injuries, and it seems like it's been a really tough road for a lot of people in fantasy, with a lot of stars being out this early in the season. Like it's been like a month.
And this won't be a totally self-serving thing. Like we're here to serve the people always, first and foremost. But there are I have friends who have complained vehemently about fantasy basketball this year. So let's get into it. Fantasy basketball this year, and really in this time, Dan, do you feel like, I guess post-COVID, because I feel like there's a pre-COVID version of fantasy basketball and a post-COVID version of fantasy basketball. Because now we have like IL Plus, for example, which wasn't really a thing. Do you feel like now it's harder than ever before? Let's just start with the title of this episode, because I feel like, as somebody who's played since high school, so we're talking well over a decade at this point, I feel like it's gotten more challenging because there are, in my opinion, more late scratches, more questionable, like in-depth injury reports, more things to watch out for. And it feels like leagues need to have more ads and things of that nature. So do you feel like it's more difficult now than perhaps ever?
Yeah, I think it's put more pressure on commissioners, to be honest, to run their leagues appropriately, because you're right. Coming out of the pandemic, we didn't really know how to approach all of these frequency in injuries. And I think the injury reporting has been the most suspect thing for fantasy and betting too. Like it could go both ways. Like these last minute call outs and people that weren't on the injury report that magically show up 2 hours before the game or even 45 minutes before the game. I think that's the part that's really been harder over the years. And I've been playing fantasy basketball for, well over 25 years, I think. And, in the early 2000s, we didn't have the issue of people wanting to load manage or whatever. Totally get it now if that's the new norm of the league. But playing a game and trying to manage that, and if you're a casual fan that doesn't stare at his phone all the time or looking at the numbers, it's hard to keep track of your lineups. You don't know. You might miss someone that's called out last minute. Me, I stare at this stuff all the time. I'm a degenerate. I have a lot of fantasy basketball teams and a lot of different types of formats. So for me, it doesn't matter. I think that just increases the strategic value of this game, which makes me appreciate it even more. I think it's way harder than fantasy football, which to me is just a game of luck. Whereas fantasy basketball, we can talk about the different formats, but you play in a head-to-head league, a categories league. And I think that that's just the epitome of roster management. You'd never win in the draft. You have to be diligent. There's going to be injuries. There's going to be rest. Like you have to take care of so many factors on top of knowing the statistics to balance out your team. So at a high level, I think I could agree with you. It has become increasingly harder between the injury reporting, the frequency of players being out by injury or load management, but then also just the state of the way the league is. I think we just seen a paradigm shift of the availability of stars is just not as prominent as it used to be.
I have a categories league team that is getting its ass whooped 5-4 every single week. It's not even getting their ass whooped in terms of the totality.
That's not even an ass whooping. Like you get smoked 7-2. Like that's an ass whooping.
But they can't get wins. And it's win-loss. It's not just like adding. It's not just like we're competing in the categories only.
Sure.
That league also, this is what I want to ask, has 5 ads per week and 4 injury slots. The other league that I'm in, because I'm only doing 2 because like mental health purposes. I'm too competitive, and it's like I need to focus in on like 2-3 teams max. Like for fantasy football, which I don't like as much, I have 2 teams. And I get wrapped up into it because I just hate losing. Like in one league, I just missed out on the playoffs barely because of point differential. And in the other league, I'm in first place with a bye. So we're all good. Basketball, though, like I have a points team and I have the categories one. Categories to me is just more challenging. And the points league has 6 injury slots, which I thought that was excessive. And I've used all 6 multiple times this season, Dan. Multiple times. I've had 6 people: Evan Mobley, Austin Reeves, Jonathan Kuminga, like all these different guys, Bam at one point. and that league has only 4 add-ons per week. Do you feel like there's a sweet spot now for fantasy basketball players, and what is that sweet spot now? Because I felt like 3 at one point was the most accepted number, and I feel like now we kind of need 5 because of the late, just in and outs that we see from an injury report perspective, and then just guys getting dinged up all the time and load managing.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to attack this. I think first, it probably depends on how deep your bench is. So if you only have like 3 bench spots, you don't need 5 IL. But I think the default should be IL plus, because that gives fantasy managers the flexibility
That's what I
to,
mean. Yeah.
whether it's day to day or a long term injury, either
Yeah.
way, you're stashing them in there.
Mhm.
Whereas Yahoo doesn't allow you to do that yet. I'm lobbying for that behind the scenes for that to be changed. We'll see if it happens. Um, Other part of that is, I think the transaction limits each week, I think, should be maxed out at 5. I think having a transaction a day is a bit much. And I think that also puts pressure on your fantasy managers, your other league mates, to be very active and aggressive in the league. You would hope that they would be doing that anyway. But I think that there could be some abuse going on if you have a transaction a day. I would prefer it, like, if everyone wants to be a degenerate and look at who's the next man up every single day, that'd actually be a pretty fun league. But I think the average league, probably 5 is the extent that I would go to. And for IL, I think 3 IL plus would be enough, because that gives enough room for you to make some tough decisions, which I think is another element of fantasy, is like, do I want to drop this guy? Can I afford to drop this guy? And then putting people back out in the waiver pool, because you don't want to have so many IL spots that you wind up hoarding a whole bunch of players. And the next thing you know, you go back to waivers, you're adding and dropping, and there's like nobody left by Sunday because everyone's doing the same thing as you. So I think that there's a fine balance you can get. I would say 3 IL, 5 transactions per week. That's what I generally do if I'm commissioning a league. That's kind of where I stand it at. But one other caveat to that is, I've seen some more energy around putting games caps limits on fantasy leagues, which I think is interesting, because
Mm.
that way you're not having to fight the battle of, oh, I didn't get enough games played this week. Because, like, look at week 7 in Yahoo, for example.
Mhm.
It's a 2-week period, scoring period, and you're only going to be able to use your transactions once.
Yeah.
You could have the luck of the draw of having a bunch of Hawks players, Bucks players, everyone that's in the NBA Cup. You're going to be getting 2-3 more games X over your opponent. You can't do anything about that. Like, that's out of your control.
Right.
But if you have a games cap, you only start 4 players each week at each position. Then you have to decide, what matchups do I want to attack? And then it kind of
Mm.
evens the playing field. If everyone plays 40 plus games a week, then it's really about who made the right decision on who to start in the right situations. I personally don't like playing that way, but I think it's a fair way of evening out the playing field, so that you can avoid people just running to waivers and stacking up those counting stats to get an edge over their opponents.
I mean, it's interesting because when you say it, I'm like, it does even the playing field. It also requires you to be more strategic and diligent, also staying on top of, like,
Right.
not just ads or whatever the case may be, but how you're going to strategize, as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, which matchups to attack, which is really the secret to fantasy football in a lot of ways. It's like, all
Very
right,
much so.
you
Yeah,
know,
you're right. It is
I
kind of blending the two. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, like, I want to attack this specific matchup. Like, Jaden Reed is supposed to go off against the Detroit Lions because their secondary is missing players, and then he gets fucking nothing.
I'm about to say, where
Thursday
do you
night.
go with Jay? I'm pretty sure he just put up a goose egg, putting up
Oh,
them
whew.
Tony Snell empty calories type stats. Yeah.
Thankfully, he wasn't the reason I lost. It was Jamar Chase on the other side, but it's fine.